February 20th, 1838. Old Ford, Bow, London. Jane Alsop, 18 years old, steps to her front door with a candle. The man outside says he's a police constable. He takes the candle from her hand, and then the light catches his face. The eyes glow red-orange, like coals burning in the dark. The fingers around the candle end in metal claws. And before she can move, blue fire pours from his mouth directly into her face. Jane screams. Her sisters pull her back inside. She survives. But what knocked on her door that night had been roaming London's streets for months and would not stop for another 66 years. Jane Alsop's attack was not the beginning. It was the moment the lid came off. On January 9th, 1838, 6 weeks before Jane's door was knocked on, the Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cowan, stood before a packed public meeting and revealed something extraordinary. He admitted, been sitting on a pile of letters from terrified citizens for months. Letters from servants, from merchants, from respectable householders across London's suburbs, all describing the same creature. A figure that leaped over garden walls, that vanished into darkness, that attacked without warning and disappeared without explanation. Sir John had kept the letters secret, hoping the terror would simply fade. But the letters kept arriving, and the attacks kept happening. The first confirmed sighting had occurred in September 1837, 4 months earlier, near Barnes Common in southwest London. A merchant named William Skegum reported being leapt upon by a terrifying figure that then bounded away over a 14-foot cemetery wall and simply vanished. 14 feet, in a single leap. Sir John Cowan had waited long enough. The public had a right to know. Across dozens of independent accounts, from servants to soldiers, from Liverpool to London, from 1837 all the way to 1904, the descriptions of Spring-Heeled Jack remained disturbingly consistent. The creature stood well over 6 feet tall. It wore what witnesses variously described as a tight white oilskin suit, a close-fitting metallic helmet, or a flowing black cloak. Its eyes were described again and again as glowing red-orange balls of fire, not reflecting light, but generating it. Its hands ended in sharp metallic claws that could rake flesh and tear fabric. And then there was its most singular ability. It could leap, horizontally, 25 to 30 feet in a single bound. Vertically, clearing walls of 8, 10, 15 feet as though gravity were a suggestion rather than a law. No witness ever reported it running. It moved in great bounding arcs, each one carrying it further from reach. Nothing in Victorian England, no technology, no athlete, no animal, moved like that. And yet here were dozens of ordinary people across decades and geography, describing the same impossible thing. Victorian England needed a rational explanation, and for a time, they thought they had one. The prime suspect was a man named Henry de la Poer Beresford, the 3rd Marquess of Waterford, and his reputation preceded him like a thunderstorm. Known across London society as the Mad Marquess, Beresford was an Irish nobleman with a documented history of violent pranks, late-night assaults, and spectacular acts of public mayhem. He had once painted a tollgate red. He had brawled his way through multiple county fair incidents. He had assaulted constables and generally conducted himself as though the laws of England were a personal inconvenience designed for lesser men. Rumors circulating at the Garrick Club held that the Marquis had made a bet with fellow aristocrats, that he could use spring-loaded devices in his boots and a flame-spitting apparatus hidden under a cape to terrorize all of London. He was athletic. He had the money to fund custom equipment. He had the temperament to attempt it. And crucially, he was of exactly the right class to avoid arrest. The Mad Marquess fit the theory perfectly. The only problem was what happened next. February 1838. The Metropolitan Police, less than a decade old at this point, took the extraordinary step of convening a formal investigative committee specifically to address the Spring-Heeled Jack attacks. This was not routine. This was an institution mobilizing in a way that implicitly acknowledged something serious was happening on London streets. On February 28th, 8 days after Jane Alsop's attack, a woman named Lucy Sales was assaulted in Limehouse. Same description, same cloak, same glowing eyes, same metallic claws. Jane Alsop gave sworn testimony before the committee. Multiple other victims came forward. The case file grew, and when the committee concluded its investigation, having examined witness after witness, having heard sworn testimony, Having reviewed letters from across the city, not a single arrest had been made. Not one person was charged. Not one suspect was brought to trial. The Metropolitan Police, formally, had nothing. And in the meantime, the terror had spread far beyond London's boundaries. Volunteer night patrols were organizing in multiple neighborhoods. The penny press was printing Spring-Heeled Jack on its front pages daily. And a man who had beaten Napoleon was about to put on his coat and ride out to investigate himself. In the spring of 1838, the Duke of Wellington was 68 years old. He was the most celebrated man in the British Empire, the victor of Waterloo, the slayer of Napoleon, a man whose name was synonymous with unbreakable resolve. And he was sufficiently alarmed by the Spring-Heeled Jack attacks that he personally armed himself and rode out on horseback at night to patrol the streets. Let that settle for a moment. The greatest military hero in British history was saddling his horse after dark to hunt a thing that was terrorizing his city. Wellington was not alone in his alarm. Volunteer patrols had organized across multiple London suburbs, groups of armed citizens walking the streets at night, hoping to intercept the creature. Parliament itself had begun receiving questions about what the government intended to do about an attacker who had struck multiple times, evaded every constable, and apparently could not be caught or stopped. A nation that had defeated Napoleon, that controlled a quarter of the world's land surface, that considered itself the apex of civilization, was being made to feel afraid. On its own streets, at night, by something it could not explain. From 1863 onwards, something peculiar happened. Spring-Heeled Jack crossed over. A penny dreadful serial titled Spring-Heeled Jack, The Terror of London, began publication and ran for years, selling hundreds of thousands of copies to a readership that thrilled to the creature's exploits. But the serialized Spring-Heeled Jack was not a monster. He had been rewritten as an anti-hero, a caped acrobatic figure who leaped over rooftops to fight criminals and expose corruption, a kind of proto-superhero decades before the concept would be formalized. Victorian England had done what human beings always do when they cannot explain something frightening. They turned it into a story they could control. And yet, here is the detail that makes your skin prickle. Throughout those years of fictional publication, throughout the decades when Spring-Heeled Jack was entertaining readers across the British Isles as a penny dreadful character, real people in real towns were still filing police reports, still swearing they had seen the creature, still describing the glowing eyes, the metallic claws, the impossible leaps. The fiction and the reality existed simultaneously, and the Mad Marquess, the only suspect ever seriously proposed, had been dead since 1859. March 29, 1859. Henry de la Poer Beresford, 3rd Marquess of Waterford, fell from his horse in County Waterford, Ireland. He did not survive the fall. The Mad Marquess, the man who had been whispered about at the Garrick Club, the one Victorian England had quietly blamed for the whole terrifying business, was dead and buried. The logical conclusion was obvious. Spring-Heeled Jack, whoever or whatever he was, would now stop. The pranks would end. The attacks would cease. The creature that had haunted London's suburbs for 2 decades would dissolve back into urban legend with its architect gone. That is not what happened. Sightings continued. Across Britain, through the 1860s, through the 1870s, through the 1880s. Not in London only, in Wales, in the Midlands, in the North. Not by isolated lone witnesses in dark alleys, either. By multiple witnesses. In some cases, by crowds. The Marquess had been in the ground for years, and Spring-Heeled Jack was still out there. Every theory built on a single prankster died in that Irish field alongside Beresford. Whatever had been happening for the past 2 decades, it was not something one flamboyant aristocrat had cooked up in 1837 and sustained through sheer audacity. The question that Victorian England had been avoiding now had nowhere left to hide. August 1877. Aldershot Garrison, Hampshire. One of the most fortified and disciplined military installations in the British Empire. 2 sentries on night watch, trained soldiers, armed, sober, on duty, reported being struck by a pale figure that appeared from the darkness without warning, delivered a series of slapping blows, then bounded away in what they described as enormous leaps. This was no panicked servant in a dark alley. These were British Army soldiers, and they reported it to their commanding officer. One of the sentries raised his rifle and fired directly at the retreating figure. A military-issue rifle. At close range, the figure did not fall. The figure did not stumble. According to the account reported in the Hampshire Telegraph, it simply continued bounding away into the darkness, apparently unharmed, until it disappeared entirely. Think about what that means. Either a trained British soldier missed at close range, possible, in darkness, at a moving target, or the shot connected, and it made no difference. An entire armed garrison had encountered Spring-Heeled Jack, opened fire, and had nothing to show for it. No blood, no body, no arrest, only the darkness, and the echoing question of what, exactly, had just been walking around the perimeter of a British military base. 1877, Newport, Wales. It was no longer happening in London's foggy back alleys. It was no longer a single servant or a solitary sentry. In Newport, hundreds of residents poured out of their homes and into the streets because Spring-Heeled Jack was visible from the ground, in public, bounding across rooftops above the town. Not glimpsed for a moment in darkness and then gone. Seen by a crowd. Leaping from building to building in full view of the street below, the figure described with the same characteristics that had been reported since 1837. The impossible height of each jump, the blazing eyes, the silhouette against the night sky. Victorian Wales stood in its streets and watched, and had no explanation. Here was the most scientifically progressive civilization the world had yet produced. The nation of Darwin and Faraday and Brunel. The empire that had mapped the globe, that was laying telegraph cables under the ocean, that was building iron railways across continents. And its citizens were standing in the streets of Newport, watching something leap across their rooftops that none of them, not one, could account for. After 40 years of sightings, Spring-Heeled Jack had not become easier to explain. It had become harder, because now it had been seen, in broad confirmation, by people who could not all be wrong at the same time. Everton, Liverpool, 1904. 67 years had passed since William Skegum was leapt upon at Barnes Common. 3 generations. 2 queens, 1 king. The railway age, the telegraph age, the early automobile. And then, in the terraced streets of Everton, thousands of residents reported watching Spring-Heeled Jack bound across rooftops in broad daylight. Not at night, not in fog, in daylight, visible to a district of the city for several minutes before the figure vanished. Eyewitnesses went to newspapers. The Liverpool Echo covered it. And then, as if whatever this was had decided that 67 years was enough, it stopped. No reliable mass sighting was ever reported again. After 1904, Spring-Heeled Jack receded from the historical record with the same inexplicability with which it had entered it in 1837. It simply ceased to appear. No final capture. No revelation. No deathbed confession from a Victorian prankster explaining the elaborate machinery behind 6 decades of terror. The file, such as it was, just went cold. 670 years of British history hadn't produced anything that behaved like this before. And the 67 years it took place in encompassed the entirety of the Victorian era, from its terrified beginning to its optimistic end. In the century since the last sighting, historians and researchers have applied every rational framework they could find to Spring-Heeled Jack. None of them hold. The spring-loaded boots theory, the idea that a talented acrobat fitted with mechanical spring devices could produce the leaps described, founders immediately on the technology of 1837. Nothing like the equipment that would be required existed. Nothing has ever been found. No patent. No device. No spring apparatus recovered from any Victorian scrap heap. The gas-powered jumping mechanism theory? No blueprint. No components. No engineering precedent. Mass hysteria? It cannot explain the Aldershot military garrison encounter, where trained soldiers filed a formal report and one fired his rifle. It cannot explain the daytime Newport and Everton sightings, witnessed by crowds independently. The lone prankster theory was buried in an Irish field with the Marquess in 1859. What remains when you eliminate the impossible is, as a rather famous fictional detective who emerged from this same era would say, the truth, whatever uncomfortable shape that truth happens to take. Researcher Mike Dash spent years compiling the Spring-Heeled Jack archive in the 1990s and reached the same conclusion. No single theory adequately covers the 67-year, multi-witness, geographically dispersed record. Consider the weight of what Victorian England brought to bear on this case. The Lord Mayor of London publicly acknowledged the terror. Parliament debated it. A Metropolitan Police Committee investigated it. Volunteer civilian patrols organized across the capital. The Duke of Wellington, the conqueror of Napoleon, the man whose nerve had held at Waterloo, armed himself and rode out at night. A British army garrison opened fire. And at the end of all of that, silence. No official report ever concluded who or what Spring-Heeled Jack was. No government inquiry produced a finding. No Victorian authority, not the police, not the military, not Parliament, ever issued a final explanation. They simply stopped talking about it. An empire that governed a quarter of the globe, that administered millions of people, that produced official reports on everything from railway gauges to colonial grain yields, produced no official conclusion on 67 years of consistent, credible, multiply-witness terror on its own streets. That silence has a weight to it. When an institution as thorough as the Victorian British government has nothing to say, it is worth asking whether the silence is the absence of an answer or the presence of one it chose not to give. Spring-Heeled Jack was witnessed by an 18-year-old girl who gave sworn testimony, by British Army soldiers who filed an official garrison report, by the citizens of Newport, Wales, who watched it jump across their rooftops by the hundreds, by thousands of Everton residents in broad Edwardian daylight. It was taken seriously enough to mobilize the Lord Mayor, to occupy Parliament, to bring the greatest military hero in British history out of retirement and onto horseback at night. And at the end of 67 years and all of that, the file was abandoned. Not closed. Abandoned. The way you abandon a question when the honest answer frightens you more than the mystery. Victorian England never said what Spring-Heeled Jack was, and neither has anyone since. That open question has sat in the historical record for 180 years now, filed under unexplained, which is not the same thing as impossible. So here's what I want to know from you. What do you think it was? An elaborate hoax that somehow outlasted its creator by 45 years? A piece of technology so advanced it left no trace? Something else entirely? Leave it in the comments. The best theory gets pinned. And if you want more history that the textbooks quietly buried, you know what to do. Subscribe. We're just getting started.